The long haul. The highway stretched like a black ribbon through the desolate plains, its asphalt shimmering under the dim light of a waning crescent moon. Miles of nothingness flanked the road, dry, brittle grass rustled faintly in the wind, and skeletal trees loomed in the distance. Jack Diesel Thompson, a seasoned trucker with over 2 decades on the road, tightened his grip on the steering wheel of his 18-wheeler. The CB radio crackled faintly, static filling the cab as he flipped through the channels, hoping for a voice, any voice, to break the oppressive silence. Jack had been on the road for 16 hours straight, hauling a load of refrigerated meat to Denver. He prided himself on his stamina and work ethic, but even he was starting to feel the weight of exhaustion creeping in. His thermos of coffee had long run dry, and the cheap gas station energy drinks he had chugged earlier only made his hands jittery. "Gotta make it to the next rest stop," he muttered to himself, glancing at the clock on the dashboard. 2:47 a.m. Just another hour or so. The headlights of his rig cut through the darkness, illuminating a stretch of road that seemed to go on forever. Then, something odd caught his eye. In the distance, barely visible under the moonlight, was a figure standing on the shoulder of the road. As he got closer, the figure came into focus, a man wearing a tattered plaid shirt and jeans, his face obscured by the brim of a battered cowboy hat. Jack slowed down instinctively. Hitchhikers weren't uncommon, but something about this man felt off. His posture was unnaturally rigid, and he didn't stick out his thumb like most people looking for a ride. Instead, he just stood there, motionless, as if waiting for something, or someone. Jack's gut told him to keep driving, but as he passed the man, a strange chill ran down his spine. He glanced in his side mirror, expecting to see the hitchhiker shrinking into the distance. But the shoulder of the road was empty. "What the hell?" Jack muttered, his hands tightening on the wheel. He checked his rearview mirror. Nothing. The hitchhiker was gone. Shaking his head, he chalked it up to fatigue playing tricks on his mind. He reached for the CB radio and tried another channel. "Breaker 19, this is Diesel. Anyone out there?" Silence. Then, a burst of static. "You shouldn't have stopped," a distorted voice crackled through the speaker. Jack froze, his heart pounding in his chest. "Who's this?" he demanded, but the radio went dead. The miles dragged on, and the oppressive silence inside the cab grew heavier. Jack's thoughts kept drifting back to the hitchhiker. Had he really stopped? He couldn't remember. The memory was hazy, like a half-remembered dream. As the minutes ticked by, his unease grew. The road seemed different. The reflective markers on the asphalt were spaced farther apart, and the trees lining the highway appeared more twisted, their gnarled branches reaching toward the sky like skeletal fingers. The moonlight barely penetrated the thickening fog that had begun to creep across the landscape. Up ahead, a faint light pierced the darkness. A gas station. Relief washed over Jack as he slowed the rig and pulled into the lot. The place was eerily quiet, the single pump island illuminated by a flickering fluorescent light. A faded sign above the station read, "Last Stop Gas and Diner." Jack climbed out of the cab, stretching his stiff limbs as his boots crunched on the gravel. The air was colder than it should have been for a summer night, and the silence was oppressive. Even the chirping of crickets was absent. He pushed open the door to the diner, a bell jingling faintly above him. The interior was dimly lit, with cracked vinyl booths and a long counter lined with stools. A lone waitress stood behind the counter, her back turned as she cleaned a glass with a rag. She didn't look up when he entered. "Evenin'," Jack said, his voice echoing in the empty diner. The waitress turned slowly, and Jack felt his stomach drop. Her face was wrong. Her eyes were too large, her smile too wide, stretching unnaturally across her face. Her skin had an almost waxy sheen, as if she were a mannequin brought to life. "Coffee?" she asked, her voice monotone. Jack hesitated, every instinct screaming at him to leave. But he nodded, sliding onto a stool at the counter. "Yeah, sure. Black." The waitress turned away, moving with jerky, unnatural motions. Jack glanced around the diner, his unease growing. The clock on the wall was stuck at 2:47. A fly buzzed lazily in circles above a booth but never landed. The waitress set a chipped mug of coffee in front of him. He stared at the inky liquid, noticing the way it swirled as if stirred by an invisible hand. When he looked up, the waitress was gone. Jack didn't remember leaving the diner. One moment he was sitting at the counter, and the next he was back in his truck, the engine idling. The clock on the dashboard still read 2:47. The highway was different now. The road signs were blank, their reflective surfaces offering no guidance. The trees that lined the road had disappeared, replaced by an endless expanse of black nothingness. Even the stars were gone, leaving the sky an impenetrable void. Jack's grip on the wheel tightened as he drove, his headlights cutting through the thick fog that clung to the road. The unease in his chest had grown into full-blown panic, but he couldn't stop. He didn't know why, but the thought of stopping filled him with a primal dread. The CB radio crackled to life again, and Jack nearly jumped out of his seat. "Breaker 19, this is Diesel." "Who's out there?" he said, his voice trembling. A familiar voice answered, distorted and filled with static. "You shouldn't have stopped." Jack's blood ran cold. "Who the hell is this?" The voice didn't respond. Instead, a low, guttural laugh filled the cab, growing louder and more distorted until it was a deafening roar. Jack slammed the radio off, his heart pounding. The headlights flickered, and for a brief moment, Jack thought he saw something in the road ahead. A figure. The hitchhiker. He swerved, narrowly avoiding the figure, and the truck skidded to a stop on the shoulder. Jack's hands shook as he unbuckled his seatbelt and grabbed the flashlight from the glove compartment. He stepped out of the cab, the cold air biting at his skin. "Hello?" he called, his voice echoing in the stillness. The beam of his flashlight cut through the fog, but there was no sign of the hitchhiker. Only the empty highway stretched before him. Then he heard it. A faint, wet squelching sound coming from behind the truck. Jack's breath hitched as he turned, the flashlight trembling in his hand. The sound grew louder, closer, until it was right behind him. He spun around, and the flashlight illuminated a face inches from his own. The hitchhiker's eyes were black pits, his mouth twisted into a grotesque grin filled with jagged teeth. Before Jack could scream, the figure lunged at him. Jack woke with a start, his head pounding. He was back in the cab of his truck, the engine idling. The clock on the dashboard read 2:47. The highway stretched ahead, shrouded in fog, and the CB radio crackled faintly. Jack's hands trembled as he gripped the steering wheel, his mind racing. Had it all been a dream? A hallucination brought on by exhaustion? As he pulled back onto the road, the radio crackled again. This time, the voice was clear. "You can't outrun it, Jack." The voice was his own. Jack's scream was swallowed by the darkness as the headlights flickered and the void closed in around him. Midnight cargo. The road stretched endlessly before Sam Larson, a veteran trucker who had spent most of his adult life navigating the highways of America. His 18-wheeler, affectionately named Iron Stallion, hummed along the desolate stretch of Interstate 50, dubbed the loneliest road in America. Sam glanced at the clock on his dashboard, 11:58 p.m. The darkness was absolute, the kind that seemed to swallow the stars and smother the moon. His headlights cut through the void, revealing nothing but an unbroken ribbon of asphalt. Tonight's haul was different. The cargo manifest had been oddly vague, classified goods. Handle with care. Sam was no stranger to unusual jobs, but the lack of specifics made his gut churn. The loading crew at the depot had been eerily silent, their eyes darting nervously as they secured the container to his truck. "Don't stop for anything," one of them had muttered, barely audible. Sam had chuckled, trying to lighten the mood, but the man's grim expression lingered in his mind. As the clock struck midnight, Sam's CB radio crackled to life. Static hissed and popped, followed by a distorted voice. "Iron Stallion, come in." Sam frowned and grabbed the mic. "This is Iron Stallion. Who's calling?" The response was garbled, almost unintelligible. "Stay on the road, don't deviate, watch for." "Repeat that?" Sam asked, but the signal was lost in a burst of static. He shrugged it off. CB interference wasn't unusual in remote areas. A sharp thud jolted him from his thoughts. The truck shuddered, and he instinctively tightened his grip on the wheel. What the hell was that? He glanced at his side mirrors but saw nothing. His heartbeat quickened as another thud echoed from the trailer. Sam slowed the truck and considered pulling over to inspect the cargo. Then he remembered the loader's warning, "Don't stop for anything." Pushing aside his unease, he pressed on, but the noises grew louder, thuds, scrapes, and what sounded disturbingly like whispers. Sam turned up the radio, hoping to drown out the unsettling sounds, but the whispers persisted, growing more distinct. They weren't in English. The guttural, rhythmic cadence sent chills down his spine. Suddenly, the truck's headlights flickered. The dashboard lights dimmed, and the engine sputtered. "No, no, no," Sam muttered, coaxing the stallion forward. The truck slowed to a crawl before grinding to a halt. The silence that followed was deafening. Sam grabbed his flashlight and stepped out into the night. The air was colder than it should have been, and an unnatural stillness hung over the landscape. He walked to the back of the trailer, his boots crunching on the gravel shoulder. The metal of the trailer was ice cold under his hand as he unlatched the doors. The cargo container loomed before him, its surface covered in strange symbols etched into the metal. Sam had never seen anything like them. He shone his flashlight on the padlock securing the container. It was intact, but the whispers were louder now, emanating from within. "Is someone in there?" he called out, his voice trembling. No response, just the relentless murmurs. He backed away, his instincts screaming at him to leave. As he turned to head back to the cab, his flashlight flickered and died. In the pitch black, he heard it, a low growl, guttural and inhuman. It was coming from the woods lining the highway. Sam froze, his breath hitching as the sound grew closer. Then he saw them, glowing red eyes, dozens of them, peering at him from the darkness. Panic surged through him. He sprinted back to the cab, slamming the door behind him and locking it. The growls turned into howls, and the truck rocked violently as unseen forces slammed against it. Sam fumbled with the ignition, turning the key over and over. "Come on, Stallion, don't fail me now." The engine roared to life, and the headlights blazed, illuminating the road ahead. The red eyes scattered, retreating into the shadows. Sam didn't wait to question what had happened. He floored the gas pedal, the stallion lurching forward. As he sped down the highway, his phone buzzed on the dashboard. He grabbed it, hoping for some semblance of normalcy. The screen displayed an unknown number. Hesitating, he answered. "Mr. Larson," a calm, measured voice said. "You've encountered them, haven't you?" "Who the hell is this?" Sam demanded. "You need to keep driving. They'll follow, but they can't touch you if you stay on the road." "What are they?" Sam's voice cracked. "You don't want to know. Just deliver the cargo. Do not open the container. Do not stop." The line went dead. Sam's knuckles turned white as he gripped the wheel. The road ahead twisted and turned, the stallion's engine growling as it climbed a steep incline. In his rearview mirror, he saw them again, the red eyes, keeping pace with the truck, their owners obscured by the darkness. The whispers returned, louder than ever. They filled the cab, invading his thoughts. Images flashed in his mind, ancient rituals, blood-soaked altars, and monstrous figures that defied comprehension. Sam screamed, slamming his hands against the wheel. "Get out of my head!" The truck's lights flickered again, and the engine sputtered. Desperation clawed at him as he reached the summit of the hill. Below, he saw a gas station, its neon sign flickering weakly. Against his better judgment, he decided to stop. He pulled into the lot, the stallion groaning as it came to a halt. The station was eerily deserted. Sam stepped out, his eyes darting around. The air was thick with the stench of decay. He entered the station, the fluorescent lights flickering overhead. The shelves were bare, and the cash register sat open, its drawer empty. Behind the counter, a figure slumped in a chair, their head bowed. "Hello?" Sam called out, but the figure didn't move. He approached cautiously, reaching out to touch the person's shoulder. The body toppled forward, revealing a face frozen in a mask of terror, eyes wide and unseeing. Sam stumbled back, his heart pounding. A low growl echoed from outside. He turned to see the red eyes surrounding the station, closer than ever. They glowed brighter, illuminating grotesque shapes, twisted, sinewy forms with elongated limbs and jagged teeth. The lights in the station went out, plunging him into darkness. The growls grew louder, joined by the whispers that now seemed to come from within him. Sam backed into a corner, clutching his flashlight like a lifeline. The door to the station burst open, and the creatures flooded in. Sam screamed as they closed in, their clawed hands reaching for him. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the chaos stopped. Sam opened his eyes. He was back in the cab of the stallion, the engine purring steadily. The clock on the dashboard read 12:01 a.m. He looked around, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The highway stretched out before him, empty and quiet. The whispers were gone, the red eyes nowhere in sight. He glanced at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the creatures following him, but there was nothing. Sam didn't question it. He gripped the wheel and drove, determined to finish the delivery. Whatever was in that container, it wasn't his concern. All he wanted was to get off this cursed road. Hours later, as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, Sam pulled into the delivery depot. A man in a black suit was waiting for him, clipboard in hand. "Mr. Larson," the man said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Thank you for your service." Sam stepped out of the cab, his legs trembling. What the hell was that? What's in the container? The man's expression didn't change. "That's classified. You've been compensated for your troubles." Sam opened his mouth to argue, but the man raised a hand. "Some roads are best left untraveled, Mr. Larson. Consider this a warning." The container was unloaded, and Sam watched as it was transferred to another truck. The symbols on its surface seemed to writhe in the morning light, as if alive. Sam climbed back into the stallion and drove away, vowing never to take another job without knowing exactly what he was hauling. But deep down, he knew he'd never truly escape the horrors of that night. As he merged onto the freeway, his CB radio crackled to life. A distorted voice whispered, "We'll see you again, Sam." The stallion's engine roared, drowning out the sound. Sam gritted his teeth and kept driving, the open road stretching endlessly before him.